So, Megan Olson, can you put that toward me? Megan Olson's work is inspired by the history of painting, nature, and the power of abstraction as an art form. She explores the formalist qualities in abstract painting through color, form, composition, and surface. Over the course of her art practice, she has developed a visual language of non-decipherable abstract forms inspired by diverse sources ranging from the natural world to our urban environment. Through this work, she aims to push the medium and herself as an artist. In the process, this work aims to resolve conflicting ideas, serving as a means to build harmony in a divisive, conflicted world. Through her language of abstract form and color, Olson aspires to achieve in her work a pure, direct interaction that affects the viewer on a subconscious level.
Thank you.
Megan Olson.
Thank you. So my presentation will go into my earliest influences in the hope of conveying how I've arrived at the work that I'm doing. This first image, Sleeping Gypsy by Henri Rousseau, is my first childhood memory. It was from my Art for Children book, and I was born to two very young parents in 1971 in Litchfield County in Connecticut. They both were very good artists, very interested in art and art history, and I had a lot of art around me. An Albrecht Dürer print hung in, sorry, technical difficulties again. Sorry. Albrecht Dürer print hung on the wall, and I loved him as a child. Great piece of turf by Albrecht Dürer. My father's work at the time was derivative of Red Grooms. There's his work, and there's me as a baby at one of the art fairs he was in the local town. He often spoke of the Surrealists, and I remember Yves Tanguy, Max Ernst, Wilfredo Lamb, images, and we would discuss them. And I know that Lamb in particular also influenced some of his work. In the background of that painting, I think, is, alludes to Lamb. I was 2 when my parents divorced, and I often spent my time on a weekend visit with my father going to museums. I believe this is where I really developed my love of art through the conversations and exposure to it. And because my parents had me at such a young age, their friends didn't have kids yet, so I spent my time with adults being talked to like an adult. And as I reflect back on it now, I believe this kind of set me up to become an artist. My mother and I lived in Harrison in New York for the first 2 years of high school in the 80s, and I often came into the city to see various punk rock and new wave shows when I was 15 and 16. At the time, the East Village art scene was in full swing. I loved coming into the village and hanging out, and my mother gave me this book called Art After Midnight, and I really loved it. Keith Haring. I wouldn't say looking at this book now that the artist I liked so much back then as a teenager, particularly Kenny Scharf, had any impact necessarily on the work I do now, but rather the sort of obscure artists in one of the photos who I've come to be familiar with later, named Rommelzy, for example. He's the guy on the far right. He had an incredible show a few years ago that was very, very interesting. This book at the time was really special to me because it was showing the culture of that era in its own time. And interestingly, one of the artists featured in this picture, Futura 2000, the guy with the sunglasses on, I ended up meeting him recently at a book signing. In 1987, my mother was diagnosed with lupus and couldn't take the East Coast winters anymore, so the two of us moved to Los Angeles. We made a stop in Santa Fe, and that had a profound effect on me. The high elevation made the sky look low and expansive, and Georgia O'Keeffe became a favorite of ours. I was expecting LA to look like New York City, a big city, and was surprised to see the sprawl, but I took to it and enjoyed my time there very much. I was very fortunate to have an excellent art teacher in high school who did 2 things that really made a mark on me as an artist. One of the formative things this particular teacher, Peter Oswald Dustin, had us do was to copy known artists' work in order to learn technique. And at the time, Georgia O'Keeffe was a big deal. There was a huge retrospective of her work at LACMA, and she had recently passed away. And having just seen the beauty of the landscape of Santa Fe, I understood what she was seeing in those bones and big skyworks. I painted 3 O'Keeffe works then, red poppy, apple blossom, and a cow skull. And it was one of the most valuable lessons I've ever had, because painting like O'Keeffe taught me about gradation. The way she was able to paint so seamlessly from light to dark with a barely perceptible change was something I came to admire, and something I do in my own work today. The other very formative things that this teacher taught me was that on a visit to LACMA, he explained what it took to make abstract art. And I was looking at a Jackson Pollock, not really understanding it in typical dilettante fashion, when he told me that abstraction is really, really hard to create. That all of the abstract expressionists were adept draftsmen and could paint figuratively. This is a Pollock. De Kooning at age 17. They're very good at painting from life, and in fact, you have to be good at that first to have a foundation, and when you've mastered that, then you can tap into the subconscious to derive images from. De Kooning later. And it's a process hard to get to that level of achievement. According to him, it's almost terrifying to make the leap from the figurative, from the realist, into the unknown, and I remember thinking at 16, I hope someday that I'm good enough as an artist to be able to create abstraction. I knew in that moment that it would take a lot of work and no guarantee that I would ever get there to reach abstraction, but it was a goal, and I had a profound respect for abstract art from that point on. When I graduated high school, I went to commercial art school to pursue illustration. I was unable to handle a full-time job, which I needed to survive, and full-time school, so I left. It never occurred to me at that time to pursue fine art. I thought whatever I studied had to be utilitarian and sure to make money. So I stayed in a career in visual merchandising and display for retail for the next 10 years. Toward the end of my time in this career, I made paintings for every display that I could, highly illustrative, watercolors. I was mostly self-taught at this point, with some schooling in illustration and color theory and a lifelong pursuit of an interest in art. I made highly detailed botanical watercolors, and the job required 60 to 70-hour work weeks, and I felt very unfulfilled, so I took a huge leap and left my career at the age of 27 and applied to go to school at the San Francisco Art Institute. I fell in love with the campus, and the city was vibrant and creative in 1995, before the dot-com bust and the tech industry took it over. It was an incredible time to be there. I'd been working in a figure drawing class back at SFAI, totally disinterested in the figure. I would focus on the curve of an elbow, the ankle bone, various parts of the body, rather than the whole, and get really detailed and obsessed with a small part. My teacher, Franklin Williams, had noticed and said, "You're not really interested in the figure, are you?" And when I said no, he said, "Then you don't have to draw it." He gave me permission to open my mind and free up as an artist by saying that. And at this time in the late 90s, it felt like the socio-political or figurative art that had some kind of narrative were the only things allowed. It was the era of Damien Hirst, and I would hear in other classes that you're not allowed to make art for art's sake, and painting is dead, and all of that. And I'm really glad that I was older and had formed enough of my own opinion about art to not be swayed by this overriding perception. I encountered it many times throughout my education and feel even more grateful that I lucked out and had this incredible teacher who said, "Draw what you want to." He brought in a massive tree branch just for me to draw, so I could just ignore the figure. And that is what came of it. I didn't set out to make abstract art, though it was always in the back of my mind that maybe if I kept working hard, I could be an abstract artist. But my work in those early drawing classes became more and more biomorphic. I drew more and more from an internal imaginary world while only mildly referencing the form. It came naturally, something I can't really explain, but when he brought nature into that class, it opened up the world of abstraction for me. And like Mondrian, I had arrived at abstraction through drawing trees. This was a drawing I did while working at a job in a store. It was the reflection I saw on a square plate that was really my first work of complete abstraction, I think. And I remember vividly there weren't many students working in abstraction or natural forms for that matter. Rather, much of the work was mostly figurative and conceptually driven. And I discovered in those early days that my artistic concerns were formalist in nature. Kehinde Wiley, famous artist we all know now, he was in that drawing class, and while he was very technically skilled back then, I was and still am not moved by contemporary figurative painting at all. I began to get inspiration from artists outside of the academy and from an unlikely place, the streets. At the time, I hung out socially with a lot of people in the hip hop scene. For my generation, Gen X we're called, it was what's referred to as the golden era of hip hop. There was a lot of graffiti in the 90s in San Francisco. It had been brewing in New York City for decades. And by the early 90s, California writers were perfecting their own version of it, and I was finding in the streets a few examples of really good technique and style in what is known as wild style, which is when the letters are so abstracted you can't read them. But to graffiti writers, it was totally legible. It was an abstract universal language, legible only to those who practiced it. And I thought conceptually and aesthetically that it was interesting, and it was definitely what you would call contemporary. This is a guy named Apex. This is a person named Saber. And interesting, when they're in their studio practice, they tend to make abstract work. Because I was older and knew what it was to be in the workforce, I took my schooling really, really seriously. It became even more serious after I was in a really bad car accident in the year 2000, and it was literally a miracle that I survived. The car was so smashed and crushed like a tin can, I profoundly realized how fragile and fleeting life is, so I became even more serious, more determined to work as hard as possible. And I pursued an opportunity I otherwise would not have gone for, and that was the New York Studio Program. It was the year before 9/11, and this program accepted 2 students per school from a handful of art schools throughout the country. It was a decision that changed my life forever, and it felt almost destined because everything lined up perfectly in a way I've never experienced before or since. I felt like New York City opened its arms and embraced me. Effortlessly, I found housing in Washington Heights and a job as a receptionist at a blue-chip gallery called Maxwell Davidson Gallery in the Fuller Building on 57th and Madison. While in this program, the pressure was really on. We had visiting artists and art critics, notable speakers, and others visiting us weekly. I had a particularly influential teacher named Dominique Nahas who told us about this movement in art that was so obsessive, so precise that your hand would make a, quote, micro gesture. He did not coin this term, but it was an apt description of a sort of unacknowledged school of artists, many represented by Jose Bienvenu, who had a gallery called 123 Watts around the corner from the studio program in Tribeca. At this time, Marco Maggi was one of those artists whose work was very compelling to me and helped shape the work I was about to create. So this is one of Marco Maggi's cutout. They're very, very small, and here's a detail, just incredibly obsessive work. I think just virtuosic in its attention to detail. This is slide cases that have tin foil that he's embossed, I imagine on the other side, using a pointed object and creating a sort of bas relief. This is another one. This is Eleno del Rivero. I set out to create something entirely new, something I had never seen before, but I was definitely influenced and inspired by this micro-gesture movement. And at this time, I had a sort of epiphany that set my entire style of work in motion. Using the already sort of biomorphic way I was working combined with the super precise, obsessive micro-gesture, I had a memory come to me that told me the next steps I needed to take. And this memory was from what I thought to be a very benign conversation at the time that I had with a graffiti writer named Quasar in 1992 when I lived in San Diego. We were talking about art, and like many graffiti artists of the old school, he was using this conversation as a way to apprentice me. The writers in those days and earlier had a similar history to the master-student relationships of the more traditional arts. A teacher, through oral history, would pass on the knowledge and ideas to the apprentice and guide them through the process. I had no intention or desire to write graffiti myself. To me, we were having an art conversation. But what he told me that day was something I drew from memory in this crucial moment of deciding how I was going to make an entirely new art form. He told me that no matter what your name or tag is, first you start with an alphabet. You want to write every letter in your own style to arrive at your own visual language. Equipped with this idea of first you start with an alphabet, I created a project for myself. I would make a small micro gesture drawing in my new biomorphic abstract style every time I took the A train from my home in Washington Heights to my studio in Tribeca and vice versa. The ride on the express train was 30 minutes and the subway was an incredibly smooth ride, and I did this religiously until I reached 100 drawings. These works, they're about 1.5 by 2 inches and very obsessive. My intention was to create my own abstract visual language, a simulation of letters without any particular meaning, though sometimes I would make a form that had a symbolic meaning to me, as I did in this next work I made called Journal, which was the first time I put all of these different forms together like sentences, and I realized that I finally arrived at abstraction through looking at nature, through practice, through microgesture, and through looking at my work as a form of language, thanks to the unconventional wisdom passed down to me by a graffiti writer explaining the process of what they do. I finally found my own style. Once I had explored this way of working, it became second nature to me, automatic writing in the truest sense of the term. I found I could apply it to oil painting and created this series of single forms in color. I used an impasto technique, so it's slightly raised in the foreground and then went over it with oil, with the color. By this point, I was getting a pretty good reception from the visiting artists, and on one occasion, Tim Rollins, the teacher from the Bronx who formed the group KOS, Kids of Survival, he was so excited about it, he told me he was going to recommend his art dealer in San Francisco to look at the work. Of course, I promptly told one of my employers, Maxwell Davidson Jr., the son of the owner, about this, to which now he became interested in the work and commissioned a piece, which he sold, and he got 2 more commissions. And now his father became interested. So this was a continuation of the microgesture I was doing, and in this I used a 0.3 millimeter technical pencil with paper from the cardboard of a matchbook as a blending stomp. So the final show at the New York Studio program, I presented my 3 new projects, and the Davidson family, the whole gallery came to view it and offered me a solo show 6 months later in the summer. It was wonderful and terrifying at the same time. I never imagined I'd be a working artist, let alone showing in a gallery on 57th Street. So I returned to the San Francisco Art Institute and created 20 works in 5 months, while also attending classes full time. It was a bit of a struggle. Not everyone was happy to hear about this at the school. So I kind of retreated even more into my own world, not really being involved in that school much anymore. I just worked nonstop. And I don't know how I managed to do it all physically, but I pulled it off and the show was a great success. And this is the Organic Abstractions, my first show. Various works. I was working mostly on paper, drawings, pastel, graphite. This is called Feather. This is called Red Line. It's an oil. Having representation early was a blessing because it forced me to work constantly, and I found looking at some of the works by artists that the gallery represented, like the kinetic sculptor George Rickey, was inspirational. I remember watching the elegant movements of these works while sitting at the front desk and thought about how to instill movement into my 2-dimensional works. And the gallery dealt with a lot of secondary market, and Mata was one of my favorites. I found the veiling and bursts of white transparency to be a beautiful effect. This is Mata, another Mata. And another artist I greatly admire was Norman Lewis, who also uses technique, this sort of veiling effect in his work. And I don't know why aesthetically I love this ethereal sort of veiling so much. I found that there's a similarity to the effect of spray paint. Norman Lewis. And in a review of this show, my first show, the writer made a comparison to the delicate drawings I was doing to Arshil Gorky's Crooked Run Farm drawings of the 40s, and it's one of the highest compliments of my life. And after that, I devoured everything Gorky. I had seen his work before, but look at it again with a fervor. And I learned that the car accident he was in that terrible one that broke his neck with his art dealer Julian Levy on Chicken Hill Road in New Milford, Connecticut, was actually the same hill that I lived on for a few years as a child, called Prospect Hill. And I would say that Gorky is my favorite artist. And when I stand in front of his work, I actually feel emotional. His commitment to the work, the intense suffering and trauma he had in his life, the work was all he could do to survive. This is called Agony by Gorky, 1947. The strides he made between surrealism, just teetering on expressionism, his time in that era in which he made this work is the most important moment in art history for me personally. My work began changing and evolving in my second show. This one's called Revolution. Synapsis was the title of the show, and it was about getting away from the drawing, though this is kind of like a drawing. This is a watercolor. But I was trying to get more into painting in oil, and I would use glazing and layering techniques to make it look more internal, more of the body, I suppose. This is called Russet Moon, and I used ink to start, and there's this wonderful substance called PVA, which is like a clear gesso you can put over a water-based medium and then layer oil on top of it. Ember was another oil on paper, this one with oil and cold wax. And my intention for this work was to create a glowing from behind, like an ember. I used barium cadmium red, which was what I heard from a teacher, Bill Berkson, that Philip Guston, who he was friends with, was his preferred red. It's, I don't think, legal anymore. It's highly carcinogenic, this barium red, but I absolutely love the color. I can't find it anymore. So I use the term synapsis because I like the idea of the connections of networks in the brain. This work, Pulse, was also oil layered on top of the PVA, and the very first layer was ink. And I think it sort of has a bit of a tempo, a bit of a pulsation. This desire of sort of making these biological, interconnected, weaving lines, I think comes from a desire to create a universal language. I feel like there's an urge to see unity in the world, and it's something I still wish for today, and I think abstraction is the best vehicle for that. The next show I did was called Still Movement. This is Red Tide. It's just oil on linen. And because I wanted the work to have a flow and energy in it, I painted it in a hyperrealist style. As the critic Hilton Kramer said, that the precision in style is largely reserved for inert three-dimensional objects. So I think that's something sort of unique is the way that I paint abstraction in lines. I render the lines, I make them solid, I make them three-dimensional, or at least attempt to with shading and highlighting. I like playing with oxymorons, both in the concept of the work and in its titles, and it's a theme I return to often. Indigo form is another oil on canvas, and I think as a more formalist-oriented painter, setting up challenges to work with is what really compels me the most. The work has to be challenging to the artist, which is why I often deliberately use warm colors in the background with cool colors in the foreground. Drifting Song is a large, I think it's 8 feet wide by 3 feet high, something like that. I like setting up a problem, trying to make the cooler colors pop when the warm is what usually comes forward. So this is a warm orange background, but and I'm sorry for the quality of the slide. The foreground is pale green, and it does sit on top. It does pop, even though orange is such a dominant color. One of the most challenging things I found as an artist was coming up with a new theme for the next show. The art dealer I had always wanted me to do something different in each show, and with the next one, he asked that I create an installation in the small room of the new gallery space in the Crown Building on Fifth Avenue, and I racked my brain trying to come up with an idea and thought about how I had been living in the city for many years and how much I missed the lush green forests I spent my time in as a youth in Connecticut. there was this place that I would go to that I used to call my thinking spot. It was like this burned out foundation in the side of a hillside, and it just had all of this moss and green coming through the stone, and I just loved it. And I really missed nature. Living in all of these cities for so long, it's still something I long for. This is a Elizabeth Street garden, and I lived around the corner from it at this time. And I was also employed part-time at this time as a floral designer in a beautiful flower shop called Palooks. It was aesthetically gorgeous place to work. And I just, again, was just very, very connected to nature. So I think the main thing, though, that prompted the next theme for my show was an observation made in a shockingly favorable review of my work by Hilton Kramer, who said, "It may be some viewers will discover a kinship with the abstractionist aesthetic of Jackson Pollock's celebrated drip paintings, but it's doubtful that any such reference is intended by the artist. What's more likely is that a familiarity with abstract painting will incline viewers to discover certain elements of abstraction in what are essentially faithful depictions of the natural world. I felt I had gained permission to create abstraction that also revealed nature from the quote, something that would allow me to connect to that yearning I had for nature and create my own environment. So I decided to create an installation of an urban moss garden and created most of the work based on plants and flowers, but still abstract. I called the installation Moss Garden. I put slate tiles and moss and plants, as you can see. I also had a display, a video going that had the song Moss Garden by David Bowie and Brian Eno from the album Heroes playing on repeat with a time-lapse video of the paintings being created. This is more of the garden I created indoors, and that is a mulberry paper scroll done in graphite. And that's the display with the song on repeat.
Where's the gallery?
It was Maxwell Davidson on 57th and 5th Avenue. They've recently gone out of business after, I think he opened in 1968, and last year they closed. So Hanging Garden, just to go back to the materials, this was on kozo paper, a beautiful Japanese paper done with gouache. And this is a series of all of the individual painting, or mostly drawings, gouache, watercolor, graphite of various plant-inspired abstractions. This is called Frenetic Movement in Gray. This is an ink background with gouache on top. I liked playing with the grid idea and having overlapping lines. This is called Morning Glory. Graphite form. It's graphite on paper. This is ginkgo. Gouache on paper. Twist. It was one of my favorite shows to date. It didn't sell particularly well, and I actually felt kind of defeated at this point because I just poured so much into it, and I really felt like I needed a change. So I had a commission for work similar to this one, Hanging Garden. I was diligently working on it, but it was just struggling to keep my attention. This is the commission I was working on. And something wasn't feeling right. And at this point, we were 4 years into Bush's war in Iraq, which was pretty disastrous. And I found it harder and harder to keep up with the micro gesture and the delicate work because there was this kind of quiet rage, I guess, brewing inside. And I wasn't really aware of it. And this might sound funny, but I saw a documentary one night on the heavy metal band Black Sabbath. They weren't a band I was interested in particularly, but their story was interesting. They all grew up in Birmingham, England, with the sound of the foundry in the background, banging constantly. It's where they got their sound from. It's how heavy metal was created, from the audio environment they grew up in. And I looked for videos the next day on YouTube and found a compilation of images for their song War Pigs, which was made during the Vietnam War. And images of war, this time juxtaposed with the current Bush administration, got me so angry and fired up I literally could not work on the delicate commission before me. All I could do was pick up some charcoal and a huge piece of paper and just make this large expressive gestures. And I kept working on it. It's a detail. I layered it with some oil. And I still hadn't arrived at an idea for the next body of work, but an incredible flash of inspiration came in seeing the David Smith show called Sprays. This is David Smith, another artist that transformed the medium for me and how I painted afterwards. So this is, I think, 1959, David Smith. It's called A Sketch of a Sculpture, 1959. Smith very efficiently put paper or canvas beneath the pieces of his metal sculptures he was painting and saved the impression of overspray from the aerosol paint he was using. Another one, 1959. And then he went in with more paint and made actual paintings of them. I was completely blown away by this concept and decided to use templates of my drawings in much the same way on canvases. So I used my own drawings and I started to use spray paint. And this is the same works, a little bit more developed. I created my next solo show titled Spray Paintings using this method. There's something that really clicked for me using one of the tools, aerosol paint, well established in art now. But to my knowledge, Smith was one of the first artists to use this new technology in the 50s. The ease with which the rapidness of using a paint like this, covering so much space in such a short amount of time, was really exciting to me since my work is so labor intensive. It would normally take weeks to arrive at what could be done in minutes. Here are two of those completed works. You can see Untitled Orange and Cold Fire. As I was working on this spray painting show, I was invited by a friend who had just moved to Berlin to come and visit and be part of a talk in a show he was organizing featuring the art historian Irving Sandler and my work and another artist, which would also be shown juxtaposed with some abstract works from the Peach collection. The Peaches were some of the biggest collectors of surrealist and modernist work and had one of the most incredible private collections I've ever had the pleasure of seeing in my life. It was an honor to be shown with some of the other works by modernists such as Pollock, Masson, early David Smith, early Rothko. And here I am talking with Irving, just one of my most cherished memories, sitting under an early David Smith, and to my right is an early Rothko. Irving, I don't know if people here know him. I'm sure many have met him. His humbleness and his love of artists is just something I've never seen in another art historian or critic, and I think he was a national treasure. At this point, our friend proposed that we move to Berlin. He had just had a 7-figure commission, newly flush with cash. He wanted to hire my husband to set up more of these events, this time with Donald Cuspit and the former Guggenheim director Thomas Messer, so we jumped at the chance to move to Berlin, where we could actually afford to have medical insurance and a decent place to live. We took the leap and moved there in the beginning of 2009. Of course, we didn't prepare for the aftermath of the financial collapse that had just happened late in 2008. So in early 2009, I had my show Spray Paintings in New York and could feel the sort of angst of the recession right away. This is like early February 2009. And so this is the Spray Paintings show that was inspired by David Smith. That's called Big Sky on the left and Almost Blue. This is called Binary Star. Silver spray paint, very minimal amount of work, but I really loved the outcome of it. Back in Berlin, I continued working on large works, my own version of sprays, while producing these more intricate and obsessive pieces for the art fairs. Here are some of the works I made in between the large spray oils for the 2 solo shows I had that year. This is called Gradation, and it's done in gouache. And this is called Sound Travels, watercolor. And this is called Intersection, which is a combination of watercolor and gouache. This was my busiest, most promising year to date, and of course the recession just kind of crushed everything. I had a very shady art dealer in Berlin that the New York dealer was pretty angry about, and the whole thing kind of turned into a disaster. It was already being felt in Europe by this time. And the reception to my oil paintings, the spray paintings, was never great. I have found much more success and accolades from continuing in the vein I started in, but I needed to work big, and I needed to work expressively instead of tight and controlled. And I didn't really care about the reception. It was just a process I needed to work through, one I'm still working through now. The title for the show was Beyond the Chains of Illusion. This is derived from Erich Fromm, the German social psychologist whom I was reading a lot of at the time. Large works on paper and oil on linen, using the spray paint technique in the background and then continuing with solidifying everything in the foreground. This is called Slippin' Into Darkness, the song by War that you may know about. On the left and to the right is named Quasar. It was dedicated to Quasar, the graffiti writer I had one conversation with in 1992 and has no idea who I am, probably would not remember me, but I'm really grateful for that conversation because it spurned my thinking about a universal language and starting with an alphabet of my own making. After a year in Berlin, following the financial collapse, we spent some time in California and eventually worked our way back to New York. I started to work on what would be my final show with the Davidson Gallery. One of my first works made after coming back to California from Berlin was aptly named Tumult. This is gouache on paper, gouache and watercolor. This is called Legible Fiction. Also gouache on paper. This title actually comes from a songwriter friend of mine named Robert Dayton, who has a great way with words, and it tapped into that oxymoronic tendency I have in titling things. The form's highly rendered, thus legible, but completely abstract, hence fiction. This is called Wing. I don't know where it came from. I just wanted to paint something that felt like a skeletal wing and in the shape of a pinwheel. Very graphic, interesting shape. And this one is called Melody, which was an appreciation of the nature I found once back in Northern California, where my biomorphic shapes and inspiration led me into abstraction. It's watercolor and gouache, which I think are two of my favorite mediums to work with. The last solo show that I had at Maxwell Davidson had some works inspired by my time in Berlin, most notably Jugendstil, which this is titled. Jugendstil is a form of ironwork developed in the 1890s through 1910, and it was just throughout German cities, and I absolutely loved it and was very inspired by it. Other works inspired by my time in Berlin were Berlin Journal, gouache and ink, and this drawing, which is colored pencil and graphite. And then this is the last solo show I had with the Davidson Gallery called Legible Fiction, a return to works on paper. This is called Celestial Blues. It's about 60 by 40 inches, and it's based on a song by Andy Bay, the jazz artist. And this is called The Blue Oneness of Dreams, another song title. And just a close-up of the work Sound Travels. And now we arrive at the most recent history. This is called Red Spray. A short documentary was made about me, and in it, I mentioned the early inspiration I found in the San Francisco graffiti scene in the 90s, and all of a sudden, I got discovered on social media, not by another gallery, but with a community of New York graffiti writers who were active in the 80s. They discovered me, invited me to be part of a few group shows that's been really interesting. They have no idea of my history showing in the New York art world, and frankly, none of them really care about that. They've created their own entire subculture that exists and always has existed without public approval. And I recognize how underground this scene is and feel kind of honored that they would invite me in, since I myself am not a writer. So I've done some interesting projects that have me going way outside of my comfort zone, like this show where I had to paint a sign. And then another show where I was asked to paint sneakers, which actually forced me to have to experiment and come up with a way for me to get my work into a much more graphic form that could be transcribed onto three-dimensional objects. It's been very challenging. It required the purchase of an airbrush and several experiments with color and how to lay the color in order and what happens when that color goes down and how does it look. So I experimented with tons of color studies. And as a result, I have just a ton of these color studies that I've been working on. And now I've been asked to paint on sweatshirts. And it harkens back for me that era in the 80s that I remember, the East Village art scene, when Keith Haring, taking cues from his mentor, who was actually a graffiti writer known as LA2, they started putting his images on clothing. And this is something that that culture has been doing for decades, but is only now becoming part of the mainstream. This is at the New Museum where they're selling the sweatshirts. Well, it's closed right now, but they were selling the sweatshirts. And I've also been asked to collaborate and paint murals with graffiti artists, which is kind of terrifying because even though I've been painting my entire life with a brush, when presented with an aerosol can, I'm a complete toy. I don't have the can control they do. I don't have the knowledge of the material and the medium the way they do. And so they've become teachers in a way, explaining patiently to me how to create the flow and consistency and technique I wish to achieve. These guys can see letters in everything I create. They can envision exactly what I need to do to create my abstract work without templates, the way I've been doing it, and they have the patience and the interest and excitement to see what I can do with spray paint. I really never felt so embraced by a community before, excluded, of course, this one is wonderful. This came before American Abstract Artists. And I'm grateful for the opportunities they've given me to work out these ideas. But it's terrifying. I mean, and that's what's exciting to me, to work this big. It's another great challenge that I set up for myself. It's uncharted territory, huge walls that need to be done quickly and well, and I'm totally outside of my comfort zone because the whole thing is being done in public. This is a work that I did with a graphic artist named Olga Correa from the Bronx, who's extremely talented, and we work incredibly well together. Our work just goes really well together. I don't know how, it just works, and she's great to work with. Among these projects that has been really interesting is the collaborative nature of it. I'm used to working long hours in the studio alone, totally isolated, where this is done with several people and everyone working together on one wall. Also, for my part, I don't think of what I'm doing as street art, but rather bringing fine art to the streets. Most of these works have been done in East New York or Bed-Stuy, communities that don't normally have exposure to the kind of art you see in a 57th Street gallery, and I feel fulfilled that I'm bringing abstraction to the attention of communities that aren't as familiar with it, but using a familiar medium in spray paint and through the lens of inspiration that people from those communities brought into my life. It feels a bit full circle to me now. So this is before, and this is when Olga stepped in. And as I wonder what the future holds for me in the continued development of my abstract language, an interesting, very futuristic thing happened. When photographing my work, this pair of pants I painted on, I had auto-translate on my phone, and the AI began attempting to translate it. The abstract forms just into actual language. And perhaps this is what the future holds for my work. I'm not sure. One thing is interesting is that I started moving into abstraction when I looked at it as language, and 25 years later, the new technology is attempting to read it. These experiments in the public space with murals and with the clothing has been challenging and gratifying, but it's taken me away from the fine art practice for a little while. Though I'm trying to look at these different works as all part of the same process, more experimentation, more pushing of the materials, more challenges that I'm creating for myself to figure out in a formalist way. And now I'm coming back to what I do best, in my opinion, which is a return to the inspiration of the modernist works of my child, like this work I titled Totem, where I took cues from Max Ernst and the revealing of the drips inside of the forms. Red script. This is oil on Arch's oil paper. I don't know if people are familiar with it, but it's incredibly, fairly new paper. And I like using oil as like a watercolor. And this paper takes it really, really well. I'm returning to these all-over automatic writing pieces that look like abstract language, and the meaning I'm still trying to decipher. And a glimpse here into the process of how I work. This piece titled Script is about 4 feet by 8 feet wide, and the scale of the lines is rather small. I start with a layer of yellow, or I think maybe indigo might have been the first color I use, very lightly, in order and paint the whole thing, do one pass of one color. Then I go in with a second layer of color, and sometimes a third, excuse me. And at this stage, I'm shading it with indigo in order to create a sculpted 3-dimensional feeling. And then I'll go back over it with an opaque white and make highlights that once they're dry, I'll go back over again with a yellow to make it pop. At the end. In closing, I want to say thank you for including me in this incredible, prestigious, accomplished group of artists. I don't take this organization for granted at all. I've read the history books, and I know how much this very organization has been referenced in art history. And I just want you all to know how great it feels to be part of a group of fine artists who understand art through an abstract lens and share a language that no one else in my life can understand the way you all can. So I look forward to knowing you all more and having conversations about abstract art in the future. Thank you.
I'm going to ask one person to ask a perfect question.
We're running over time. Sorry.
We got to stop doing the bus, but who's got that question? Stephen Maine?
No? All right.
Tom McLean? I can go down the road.
The thing about language is really interesting. I'm not sure what my question is, but thank you, first of all.
Thank you.
Wonderful talk. I thought you made a really nice point about the sort of the coming out of language toward the early days, and then bringing it back around with the AI, which is, I'm going to do that to my painting.
I bet all of us could have something like, yeah.
And it's a beautiful. Do you know what you're going to? I mean, you talked about that and that you might try to do something with that. Do you have any concrete ideas about where that
Not
could
yet.
go? It's
No.
such a nascent technology.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, everything's so intuitive, so it's strange that there was an actual language detected, you know? I'm never really planning to make an actual symbol or language that's readable. It's just is very strange. Yeah, I love that too. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you.
And thanks, Dave, for being the camera.
Oh yeah, my husband Dave.
Dave, one last thing. Could you help us bust the chairs out? I'll bring out the little cards.
Where did you, Stephen Maine?